Well, thanks everyone for having me again. It's been a few months since I've done a CLM. I actually presented some of this material at Winter Camp in New Mexico, and I'll go over some of their feedback. This is going to be a little more data heavy than what I normally do and a little less system dynamics, but I'm looking for insights on the data side of this. So I'll try and go through this. Some of this may be review, so I'll try and jump through those slides quickly since y'all have seen my work and research before. Um, my general research program, not a surprise to anyone in the room here, I study violence and instability created by individuals and non-state actors. My intended audience, researchers, policymakers, operational planners, military and law enforcement. Method is simulation science of system dynamics. Perspective, obviously coming from system dynamics, bias towards structural systems view of non-state actor violence. And out of boundary is behavior modes of systemic global issues, geographies and time periods outside those specified by the cases. So I try and keep limited so I can get this dissertation finished. My 3 research questions for the dissertation, again, somewhat review. 3 questions asked, 3 questions answers, the best advice, I think, for a dissertation. So I'm following that. What causes individuals to radicalize to the point they commit violence? That's actually the first part of my dissertation and what I've spent the last several months, year working on. But the second 2 parts are already published. They're already peer-reviewed and published, which is the rest of the life cycle. Is as radicalized individuals form into groups, what is the life cycle of a violent non-state actor, and what policies are effective at containing and mitigating the impact of violent non-state actors? Interesting looking at those simulation results in those journal articles now that ISIS has been vastly reduced, and seeing some of the forecasts I made. So that may be worthy of another CLM down the road. I'm not going to go into this. I've already gone on to this a whole lot. The Swarm versus Fisherman debate is a debate between counterterrorism on, do individuals radicalize on their own, self-radicalizing lone wolf, or are they influenced by non-state actors acting as terrorist groups? That's the core of this research question, and it's a big debate in counterterrorism that seems to still be going on even in 2017. The 2 guys who have been fighting this since 2006 are still fighting it. They've got a little more nuanced view. There's a little more, I think, recognition, at least by Sageman, but both still have a limited focus. They look almost exclusively at salafi-takfiri in the US and Western Europe, and they ignore other forms of radicalization, and neither has an encompassing generic framework for radicalization, which is the part I'm trying to supply. So the realization is, originally I had done data analysis just to validate the problem statement and sort of ground the article on radicalization. So I had, research. But what I realized in the Winter Camp Exposed is that no one had really looked at this perspective that people were aware of looking not just across ideology over a very significant amount of time and records, but also looking at this swarm versus fisherman, this affiliated versus individual distinction. And they said, this actual data analysis you've done could be very, very useful all on its own because it's got a unique perspective that isn't out there currently. So there also is the classic problem of, you've got one article that has data, a theoretical causal loop diagram, and a simulation all crammed into one article. Their advice was, you got the material, break it into 3. Have a standalone paper with your data research, have a second paper that is all the theory and the causal loop development in depth, and spend time on that, and publish that in something like a specialized journal of the field, and then save the simulation model for maybe a more operational research or systems engineering focused journal that can get a little bit more wonky and present some of the applications. So that is what led to this potential, and I'm going to talk with Professor Saeed in the committee, of splitting this last section of the dissertation into 3 articles. The material's, again, already mostly done, but it's just a matter of chopping it up. And part of what I'm looking for today is guidance and feedback on that approach, whether y'all think it's a good idea or a bad idea. What I'd like feedback on is, should the data be limited to the problem statement in my theory paper, or a standalone paper of its own? So this is a key question. Is there enough here and enough to work with that it makes sense to turn it into a data analysis paper with descriptive statistics, which is what I've been doing so far? Am I overlooking important questions that this data could help answer within the scope of what I'm looking at? There's a lot of data here to parse, and so there may be other things that I could slice it at that might be useful, but I don't want to, present 1,000 tables. I want to keep it fairly focused. And then the final is, should I perform inferential statistical analysis as well as descriptive? So right now I'm not saying, for example, is it significantly more this or that between swarm or fisherman, which is a sort of inferential hypothesis test question of significance. Right now, it's just descriptive. So the question is, should I leave it descriptive and save inferential for a future effort after post-dissertation, because then you can do a blind population random sample, you can do all the good stuff, or should I worry about inferential statistics now? So these are the feedbacks I'm looking for at the end, and I'm just going to start jumping in here. The data set comes from the Global Terrorism. This is the University of Maryland START initiative. They maintain the GTD, the Global Terrorism Database. I'm using it because it's an independent data set that specifically tracks individual non-state actor violence. That's their focus. They have an open source data set. There's some other ones that are licensed and limited and kind of problematic for transparent use. They have an established methodology that they've been developing for decades. So it's easy for others to take my data and replicate it, test it, challenge it. I put a link in there for the code book. It's about 65 pages. They have all sorts of the definitions of a lot of the criteria that I'm going to be using. And they already track most of this stuff. So they track the region, how many casualties there are, the success rates. They even track details like affiliation, which in their words is the person who committed or is believed to have committed these acts known to have been a part of a non-state actor group or not? And this gets right to the heart of the swarm versus fisherman debate from a data perspective is, hey, we have all this data on terrorist attacks. Who's committing it? Is it the swarm or the fisherman? And does that change over time? There's over 50 variables, so if there's a different question to look at, there's a lot of richness to go back in the database and not have to get new data. You've already got the existing information to perhaps ask a question in a different way.
Hey, Tim?
Yes.
Just swarm or fisherman. Could you define those? I don't know if I heard your definition of those.
Yeah, so go back here to this one. This is the swarm versus fisherman. It's the Sageman hypothesis and the Hoffman hypothesis. And it gets to this top weather here is what causes radicalization. And the swarm theory is that radicalization is caused by local conditions, domestic issues, and people self-radicalizing themselves. They call it a swarm, kind of like a group of guys. They call it a group of guys self-radicalizing. They may have connections on the internet, online communities. They may have offline network connection with local social groups, but they weren't connected or affiliated with an ISIS or an Al-Qaeda or the KKK or some known non-state actor group. Hoffman's hypothesis is no, that's all wrong. Yes, people do that, but really if you look behind it, you see that there's a non-state actor coming into an area and radicalizing people with recruiting and vetting and releasing propaganda. And they call this the fisherman, like a fisherman going in and fishing out a fish out of water, that's how they get these folks to commit terrorism. And this debate has been going back and forth in counter-terrorism to varying or lesser degrees since about 2006, 2008, and it has very real policy implications because your question is, what's the primary threat to the homeland? Is it homegrown terrorists, or do these, for Hoffman, it's Al-Qaeda, might be ISIS now. These were, back in the day. And they differ on the policy approaches. Should you go over and intervene and reduce the safe haven from which these non-state actors are operating from? And so this debate is sort of where I'm focusing my look at, is to try and resolve this debate by taking a system view. So does that answer your question, Jim?
Yeah, now it makes sense. Yep.
Okay.
I thought
Yep, and that's a good question because the rest of this is going to have a lot of swarm or fisherman information. So the data collection and methodology, I downloaded the GTD data set. I did this once in my quals last April, but I redid this in the last couple months to get the latest and greatest. So the data set's 1995 through 2017, and that's largely picked by when they started reliably tracking a lot of the data. They have data going back to 1970, but it's kind of spotty in what information it has. And so I started with a little bit, about 68,000 records, and then I removed everything that wasn't US or Western Europe just to have a geographical focus. That got me down to about 5,400 records. I consolidated duplicates, and a duplicate by GTD might be the 4 Paris attacks that all happened in a night because they happened at different location. They had different records. I consolidated that because to me, that's all one act. That's all one incident that's being perpetrated by a single cell or team. So 924 records got pulled out. That left me with about 4,500. GTD tracks doubtful terrorism, where they're like, hey, this might not be, there's some questions here. Again, because they have these methods, I simply removed all of them. I'm trying to exercise as little editorial control over this data set as possible because of what I'm about to do. And then I removed the outliers. This was a choice. There are 2 terrorist attacks that are so far outside the norm that they were throwing off all the data analysis I did to include them. And one obviously was the 9/11 attacks. The other was the 2017 Las Vegas casino shooting. These 2 incidents are so outside the norm in the level of casualties and the level of impact they have that they throw off the data analysis with this massive outlier. So I did remove those 2, and I've kept a database of everything I've removed so that can go back and check. But what I ended up with is about 4,400 incidents in Western Europe and the US from 1995 to 2017.
Okay, another question.
Sure.
So did you just remove like 9/11? You just removed it? Or what did you
Yes, because I mean, I mentioned that I remove it, but it's in and of itself, it's kind of to say, look, we want to look at the trend over 20 years, and that particular style of attack has never been replicated successfully versus something like the London bombings and the Madrid bombings, the subway bombings in Madrid. You've had replication. Same thing with the Las Vegas casino shooting. That thing had 850 casualties, was so far and away of any other one-person terrorist event that didn't involve a bomb or something like that, that including these 2 tended to really throw off the analysis and didn't really change the outcome too much, except created some weird outlier behavior.
Okay, I mean, yeah, I didn't think you didn't consider like a weighting model or something like that.
They're so hard. They're so, and I'll show you kind of what I'm talking about. The difference is, and this is one of the challenges of studying terrorism, the difference between a massively successful attack and a failure creates a huge difference already. So there's already, playing with weighting, and I'm interested in what you guys think of per capita weightings or other weightings, but these 2, even above and beyond, an order of magnitude more from anything else. So.
Tim, quick question. Yes. The data set you're referring to in University of Maryland is only recording actual casualties, right?
Yes, they're recording, and my definition is, because they track killed, wounded, and then terrorists killed and wounded. I actually took killed and wounded and subtracted terrorist casualties. So mine are non-terrorist casualties that were inflicted by the attack.
Okay. The reason I'm asking is it might be useful to actually know what the intended casualty numbers might look like, if that was even known.
GTD makes a distinction. Their version of success, when they define something as successful, is the attack was carried out and it caused damage or harm. They don't get into interpreting the intent of the actor and saying, like, if the actor wanted to kill 10,000 people and only killed 10, they still mark that as a success, and they don't try and get inside the head of an actor and have a what might it have been, because that data is so spotty when you have a lot of actors that are dead, unwilling to cooperate. It's historical data. It's really hard to get in the head, and I wanted to stick within a data set.
I wasn't even thinking about the intent of the actors. I was thinking about what the estimated collateral effects would have been if it had been a successful attack as intended.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess that's an interesting question. Let me write that down. That's an interesting question. So, to see if anyone's even tracking that or how they would go about as a method for that.
Because the 9/11 attack was sort of a outlier, sort of on the other side. I don't think they expected to have
exactly. Well, exactly. They didn't expect. I mean, that was beyond their kind of wild. And same thing with sort of the casino Las Vegas. If you think about mass shootings, the casino Las Vegas shooting, right. 850 casualties is so far and away above any other single mass shooting that it's kind of a weird outlier.
Right.
So I then went through, this is where I started creating an ideological category. So the GTD tracks group names, motivations. They have a lot of information, but they don't assign an overall ideology category. So this is where I started to create my own designation. And this is the designation that I put in, and it's kind of my creation. So this is a point of controversy here potentially, because these are my definitions and my analysis in assigning the data to these 9 categories. And I tried to say that if something was in a broader category, I would use that than a lesser category. So some of these have definitions that are like, if it's not in something else in here, because in some cases it may be more than one. But the categories I did was anti-government. This is anti-police, law enforcement, tax policies, municipal policies that are not already included in left wing and right wing. So there's a lot of anti-government stuff in left wing and right wing, but these particular anti-government had no obvious political ideology, left or right, that could be identified. So they went into this group. Anti-Semitic, that was specifically targeting Jews or Jewish places of worship or gathering. Crime. This is where like school mass shootings, where there's known to be an intended motivation of the actor to spread terror and to spread the message, even if that message is not ideological. So this is a crime category here. Hate crime is anything based on race, gender, religion, anti-religion, etc., but that doesn't already fall in another category. So you have here anti-religious attacks that don't have a clear ideological basis, but they're anti-religious, or maybe they're targeting a church, but it's not necessarily clear that they would fall into left wing or right wing. Left wing, anything anarchist, communist, anti-trade, anti-capitalism, anti-austerity, bailout, environmentalist, animal rights, anti-research. I recognize this and the next one are going to probably be the most controversial distinctions, but I tried to say, here's a really broad definition, and this is what is included or not included. Right wing, I did white supremacy, anti-immigrant, ultranationalist, anti-abortion, put those in this bucket. Takfiri, I used to just call this salafi-takfiri, but I broadened it to include any sort of Islamic radicalism. So we're talking state-sponsored Shia groups, self-radicalized individuals espousing Takfiri ideology. I distinguish this from separatists because there are some obviously Islamic separatists, but I did a distinction based on whether it was religious or secular motivation. So there's lots of Kurdish based terrorist attacks in Western Europe that are based on the separatism of Kurds in Turkey. And so that goes into this next category of separatism versus, say, ISIS, which has a much more religious motivation. Separatist is internal resistance group seeking either separation within the state, internal revolution, we're talking Basque, Ireland, Kurdish attacks, but as well as counter-separatist or militant movements that arise from these that are non-state actors. And then the final is unknown, whatever doesn't fit. So these 9 categories allowed me to have a perspective now on these 4,400 incidents that hasn't been done before that I know of in terms of this sort of broad 22-year look. And I go ahead.
Sorry. One category I don't see here, which I think is important, is the whole what I call the drug cartel / terror nexus.
That would be where it falls in crime. So let me add that as a definition in crime, because that would fall within crime. Cartel.
Because I mean,
narco terror. Yeah.
I mean, right now, I mean, whether it's Hezbollah or FARC, there's a nexus now between those and the cartels.
Well, and I would be careful because, I might want to, and I'm only looking at U.S. and Western Europe. So that would be one thing. With the narco terrorism in South America and the Middle East would probably be excluded from this. So those might be a little different. But I would have to look, for example, would Hezbollah be Takfiri or would FARC be left wing, for example? And that's where gets into a really tricky discussion of which is more true and more broad than more specific.
Yeah, my personal take on it is there's a missing category, which is a hybrid category, which is a mix of things like Hezbollah and the cartels, and that one is a threat to not just states but lots of other things.
And that might be a good one. I like the term hybrid because it might be a good one as this expands to other regions where you have like the Middle East, South America, Asia. You would have these sort of gray space actors. The question is whether everything would then become hybrid and how you would create a criteria. So if you have any information on a criteria that says this is how you define hybrid versus say ISIS, which is mostly Takfiri but does do some criminal activities,
right?
How do you separate those ones out? Would be great if you have anything on that.
Yeah, because you also have hybrid things like anti-Semitic and left wing, anti-Semitic right wing.
Yep.
By the way, there's a typo there. Semitic is misspelled.
Oh, my bad. Sorry. Thank you.
So, so I think you could take this data analysis into some really interesting directions when you start addressing these hybrid threats.
Well, but would the hybrid then be separate hybrid categories, or it would be one category that includes all the hybrids within it that then may lose some of the clarity, for example, between is ISIS really like FARC.
Yeah, I think it has merits as a separate category just because there's some just really prominent examples where it's so obvious that they're hybrids.
Okay, let me write that down and take a look at working on that.
Yeah, I mean, and they weren't originally hybrids; they became hybrids.
Right.
Right.
So the summary findings right now, and this is a stats table. Hopefully, this is legible on the screen. This is the total and Western Europe, and then the next screen will be US. But it's across the top here. These are just the summary findings. I've got the ideology down the left. Incident data is the number of incidents, the success rate as determined by GTD. The property damage, it's the percent with any property damage, and then the percent with damage of more than 1 million. Total casualties, percent with casualties, the average casualties with a standard deviation across all incidents, and then average casualties of incidents with casualties. So, you know, there's a lot of attacks that don't produce casualties. And so the question is, do you look at the ones that were intended to produce casualties and look at that as a subset to say, you know, judge lethality or something like that? And then affiliation is the percent that is unaffiliated. So this, you can think of this far right column as a swarm versus fisherman. The percentage here being to what extent it is swarm. So at the Western Europe level, you know, the very low amounts of swarm behavior unless you get down to Takfiri. So some things that crop out is obviously separatism is a huge problem in Europe and has been for a long period of time. It has the bulk of the incidents at 2,300, but not necessarily, and also it has a lot of casualties, but not necessarily the most casualties, which is the Takfiri at 4,600. So that's why some of these range and mean and standard deviation are important, because yes, there's a lot of separatist terror attacks, but when we talk about what's a more lethal style of attack when it happens, Takfiri and right wing become much more the Takfiri in this case in the Western Europe is much more lethal per attack that they do, and that may explain why there's the attention on it versus other ones. But this is again the summary data for worldwide the both combined in Western Europe, and here's the US version of that same. So again, the total is Europe and US combined, and you can see the success rates here, the incident rates. In this case, separatism is almost unheard of. There's a few Cuban incidents I found, very few, but left wing and right wing are by far the most common kinds of terrorism, with left wing mostly focusing on property damage for the most part and having very few casualties, where right wing has a lot more casualties over time. But again, if you look at it, instead of looking at it as total casualties over 22 years, that's one way to look at it, obviously, from a perspective of threat. But there's also casualties per incident, in which case Takfiri becomes more of a risk. And what's interesting here is if you look back, so I'm going to go, this is Western Europe here. If you look at the number of unaffiliated, these are very low percentages over the 22-year. The only one that's got any significance to it is the Takfiri. But if you look at the US now, you see these numbers jump up. So already there's an important distinction between Europe and the US in terms of this affiliation question. And we found this originally with Takfiri, but it seems to be more than just that ideology. There seems to be, and there could be culture and lots of reasons for this, but there's definitely a difference between the affiliation rate and the unaffiliated rate, Western Europe to US.
Tim.
Yes.
Another sort of category question. You don't include, or maybe the Maryland database doesn't include another form of a hybrid attack, which is a cyber attack, which in a number of instances are literally terror attacks.
Right. They do not include those currently. They only include things that cause attempts to cause property or human. They have a definition which I could crank up, and they have two sets of definitions, and it has to meet all three criteria of one and some of the criteria, two of the criteria of the second set, but they do not include cyber attacks in their definition. And I would not at this point want to include cyber attacks in mine, because it's a very different field of terrorism. I'm focusing on reduction of violence and instability. Mm-hmm. And I think cybersecurity is a worthwhile topic all on its own.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and there's lots of hybrid things there too.
Yep. So this is the frequency of incidents varying across by ideology. So this is a stack chart of the U.S. Again, 9/11 and Las Vegas are pulled out. And what you see here is you have, and the numbers here on the left are important because the scale will change when we get to Europe, but you can kind of see the frequency, and you see that anti-government was much more frequent, obviously late 90s, early 2000s, and then you see some of these changes in the width here of the bar indicate, increasing frequency. And you can look at here how anti-government has become a much smaller segment, but perhaps right wing has become larger, keeping in mind that distinction between overall lethality across all the attacks versus per attack lethality. So even though Takfiri here is this blue line that's very small here, they have a much bigger impact in terms of human cost. And so again, this is somewhat of a presentation just to see how this varies over time in the US and also in Western Europe. So Western Europe, obviously the huge contributor, and you can see here the scale is an entirely different order of magnitude. We're talking hundreds now per year. And separatism has been the sort of bane of Europe, obviously, for a long time, and continues to be. I think one of my surprise insights was that separatism, and it's more than just Ireland. It's Catalonia, it's Basque, it's Corsica. There's lots of different separatist movements, and they're contributing to an overall high rate of terrorist incidents. And then you have this the left wing is the other large contributor to terror attacks in Western Europe, even though they're not producing as many casualties. Very frequent attacks from the left wing ideology.
Tim.
Yes.
For the U.S., did the Oklahoma City bombing skew the right-wing numbers?
Well, you'll see actually on the next slide I go to, since this is a frequency, it's just one data point.
Right.
But it does skew the numbers on the this one here.
Right.
So and you can see here where I just even cut it off. So the Oklahoma bombing is a right-wing terrorist attack that had 819 casualties. And you'll see this in Europe. I do the same thing with Takfiri, where to make the graph even legible,
Right.
you have to kind of cut it off. Otherwise, there's just one incident. But I kept that in because it was a truck bomb, and truck bombs produce very high casualties. So it wasn't
Right.
an outlier of its type. It was an outlier in its overall rate of casualties. But you can also see here the salafi-takfiri, or the Takfiri ones, are spiking up as well. And this is when ISIS begins conducting its attacks in the U.S. and having more impact. And these are mass shootings.
Okay, when you talk about U.S. versus Europe, you're talking about the locale as opposed to the nationality of the target, right?
Right, where the attack took place. Because part of the study we're doing is to understand the domestic impact of Swarm versus Fisherman in your locality. What is that impact? And part of this is to get into where is the threat originating from. So you could make a really strong argument, for example, that something like hate crime, left wing, right wing, those are probably originating within domestic conditions in the US, but Takfiri might be originating from a far state actor or a far space actor that is influencing with cultural scripts. And we get into a lot more of that in the theory. This is just looking at the incident itself.
Okay.
Here's a Pareto of human impact of ideology in the US, and you can see pretty clearly that the two biggest contributors for overall human impact, again, excluding 9/11 in Las Vegas, this is why I had to put these categories in, is right-wing and Takfiri. So had I included 9/11, Takfiri would still be in the top two. It's not trying to underplay it or remove it entirely, but there would be this huge bump in the unknown because the Las Vegas shooting sort of defies a ideological description. There's no good evidence of what his intention was. So this shows the sort of the Pareto analysis of human impact risk over 22 years. And same for Western Europe, has the Takfiri on top now and the Separatist number two. And you can see that there is a difference, Western Europe and the US, in ideological risk. And this is all before we get into Swarm and Fisherman. So I'm going to pause here. This is just looking at ideology, what the data says over 22 years by ideology. What I'm going to start looking at now is Swarm and Fisherman within the ideology. So I want to pause here for more questions.
Can you go back one slide?
Sure.
So what's driving the right-wing number?
There's a lot of attacks with a small casualty rate on average per attack.
This is since 95.
Yeah, so this includes Oklahoma, and there's, let's see, total attacks by right wing in the US is 192 attacks. So there's been more attacks by the right wing over the last 22 years than anything else, except left wing's a close second. But what you look at is the left wing targeting seems to be more property based. They have 81% have property damage versus 75 for right wing, and there's a lot more extensive property damage. So if we were looking at property impact, left wing would have created more property impact than right wing. But when it comes to casualties, they have a lot, and a lot of that is coming from Oklahoma City bombing. But they've also been a lot of other attacks that are onesie twosie.
Hey, Tim?
Yes.
I don't have a question, but can you turn your volume down? It's really loud on this side and we can't turn it down.
Sorry.
No problem.
Is that better? Is that better?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know.
Lars, I have a question.
Yes.
How you classify the success rate?
This is tracked by the actual data set itself. So the global terrorism data set has a field in there where 1 is success and 0 is not success. And they have their criteria that's in that code book I linked that says how we go about determining it. So for me, this was just a calculation of what they had tracked as success rate.
Okay. And have you seen any pattern of changing a success rate along the time?
That's actually what I'm getting to, is that's one of the questions of the behavior mode. The success rates tend to cluster between 75 and 85, depending on where you're looking at, but there is some variation over time. The trick with the data is it gets down when you don't have attacks, or there's one attack and it's a success or not success, you get some choppy data.
Yeah, because I'm asking that because what I'm thinking, if there is any effect of the improvement in the let's say the police and the actions to avoid terrorism during the time, so if there is a change, so the police and the government is becoming more efficient during the time.
Success over time. Let me write that down.
Yes. So if this is relevant, then you have to do some kind of like exclude this effect in the results. Otherwise, you cannot compare the results of like the last 5 years attacks with attacks that occurred 20 years ago. I'm doing an analogy of like currency changes. So if you compare dollars, current dollars, and dollars from the 50s.
But wouldn't you want to include that in a behavior mode? So if you have a simulation over 20 years, and assuming that it is the police responses, your simulation could replicate improving police responses and demonstrate that behavior mode is reproducible.
Yes, exactly. So
okay.
to consider that.
Yep, that's a really good point. Success over time. One of the things at the end is I have this question of how do we do a case study with behavior modes to pull out, say, right wing and Takfiri and do a deeper dive of behavior modes on that, because some of these have so few instances, like Separatist. It's not going to be an interesting behavior mode. There's 5 points over 22 years. There's just not enough data, really.
Yeah, Tim and Lars, Lars raised an interesting question, because if there are discernible patterns over time that you're observing in the data, then presumably the police and government agencies would have been aware of that, hopefully. So maybe the patterns in the data would be useful in themselves. So
that's a good point, because in doing this, the reason that people recommended to make this a standalone is they hadn't seen analysis like this before.
Right.
There's been analysis on one kind of ideology, like, research will look at right wing or Takfiri or something like that, or one group over time, ISIS, something like that. But they won't look across different ideologies, and especially in the swarm versus fisherman distinction.
Right.
This is a good point, Lars. I wrote that down because I'm going to be asking what to include in case studies, and I think that success over time might be good. So this is where we left off, is the human impact. Obviously, and again, this is a descriptive analysis. So I'm doing no inferential statistics, no chi-squared or Pearson's exact test or anything like that for significance testing of the data. This is purely descriptive. And the question is, should I go to inferential or keep it at descriptive? So this is the U.S. Casualties over time and the Pareto, Western Europe. So this question is, does system state matter? Across all the incidents, regardless of ideology, is there a difference between system state, that the attacker was affiliated or unaffiliated? So this now gets into the swarm versus fisherman debate. And it's clearly visual eyeball is, well, there were more casualties from fishermen than swarm, but this is bundling all ideologies in as one. So what happens when we split it up by ideology? So this is the US casualties now by each ideology by system state. So it says not just looking at anti-government, but anti-government affiliated versus unaffiliated attackers, people who were with a non-state actor and those who weren't, swarm versus fishermen. And you begin to get into some of these distinctions that it looks like the swarm system state of all the ideologies are in general a little more lethal or a lot more lethal than the fisherman state in the US. And these are, again, average casualties per incident, excluding this is one reason why I'm excluding it, because those 9/11 in 2017 would really throw these numbers off. But you have this crime here. These are the school mass shootings and other mass shootings that have happened here, throwing this number up. The right wing is probably influenced to some degree by Oklahoma, so there's a judgment call of whether I include Oklahoma or not, but I'm including it currently. And salafi-takfiri does not include 9/11, so this is the Takfiri attacks, Orlando Pulse Club shooting, the San Bernardino attack. And you can see here those affiliated with an actual non-state actor group have been much less risky than those of an unaffiliated actor.
Tim, quick question.
Yeah.
My personal take at the moment is that it's a mistake to exclude something like 9/11 just because it, makes the graphs awkward in effect. Because I mean, you can do broken charts and things like that to indicate where the top range is.
Well, that's what I was wondering, is whether a broken chart or quartile, view or something like that. Because when I did this chart and you include 9/11, everything else disappears and you have one line that goes up to several hundred.
Yeah, I just put in a broken bar chart because I think that's why I was looking at the numbers. I'm saying right-wing numbers, really, compared to Al-Qaeda. I mean, it just struck me as peculiar.
Well, so there's two ways that debate that in the terrorism field. Is one of them looks at from a total thing. Yes, 9/11 certainly had a lot more casualties, but it's never been replicated. It's not a continuing pattern. It was a one-off. It happened, and obviously there was a huge impact from that, but it hasn't happened again. Whereas another form of template of attack is repeating regularly in the crime space or in the right-wing space or even in the Takfiri space with these shootings that happen with the Takfiri inspiration. So the question is, do you include something just to represent it because it has, or maybe you do both, like you show it in there and then for purposes of later analysis, you remove it.
I mean, this is relevant to the question of, has an organization shifted from mass casualty events, big ones like 9/11 to lots of smaller distributed attacks?
Well, I think if we're using that standard, the data is pretty clear they've shifted heavily.
Yeah, right. But I think just because it hasn't been replicated, I don't think is particularly comfortable. Because
in the room, what is the thought in the room there for this kind of question, Professor?
In your model, is the number of incidents an important variable, or the damage each incident causes? Are both variables there?
Yes. So in the data set and the model, are you talking about the simulation model now or the data set? Is that Professor Saeed I hear?
Yes, simulation model.
In the simulation model, the incident rate, the casualty does not vary, only the incidents vary. But I can disturb it. The only time we vary the casualty rate is on the disturbance itself. And that one can replicate a disturbance of a slightly more than, because there's a normal level of violence in the simulation model set for the level of the country that is just, this is what normal is. And then you have a significant above that terrorist attack and a catastrophic. And the catastrophic is meant to simulate a 9/11 one-off that could impact policy for years, even though it was a one-off effect. And whereas the significant is just a order of magnitude higher than the normal.
So I'm thinking of the relationship between data analysis and model. And again, I think it also relates to the conversation we had when I suggested that we have a meeting about partitioning your problem in such a way that there can be multiple ways to disseminate it. So if you're going to separate the data analysis and the model, there can be a number of ways that you view the data, and it's not tied with the model. If you are looking at the relationship of the data with the model, then there has to be some degree of consistency between the two. And I guess it's been a while since we discussed the model, and I cannot immediately say, the question I asked, well, the number of incidents is an important variable which is driven by other factors in the model, or is the damage per incident? Are they both there?
In the model, the important variable is the number of incidents. That's the part that will vary based off policy responses and endogenous effects in the model. The actual casualties are averaged because it's such a particular thing. How many people get hurt or killed has so many factors that are unrelated to the attack itself that I kept that as a constant. And then what I varied were the incidents or attempts to cause damage as an endogenous reaction to the model itself.
So if you're using the data to test the model validity, then perhaps the incidents which are outliers need to be excluded. But I mean, you know what I'm saying, that I'm focused on
so
the model itself.
Right. So if the question is, if I'm hearing you correctly, because I want to make sure I capture this, if the model is designed to look at incidents as a varying thing and doesn't treat casualties as all that important, then it's okay to maybe exclude outlier casualty rates that are much higher. But if it was the casualties that varied, then you might want to include those. So you need to tie the data to the model in terms of a relationship that makes sense, or a decision on what data is included or not included based on what you're trying to model. Is that correct?
You got it.
Okay. That's a very good, that's actually a great insight, because there is I do have a model, an intent of what I'm trying to model, and the behavior modes that come out of this are to say, hey, look, when we have a system state, what behavior mode are we replicating here? Or what does it look like? So
yeah. There's something that's sort of gnawing at me a little bit that's a parallel to what you see in financial markets. And this is also an insurance question. Because it's the things in the tails that will kill you, right? So some of these events are in effect tail events. So, for example, in financial disasters or market disasters, it's not just the number of events in the tail. It's fat tail distributions are characteristic of this, but it's what's the impact when you're in the tail. That's the notion of conditional VAR in market analysis, as opposed to just standard value at risk. So I think to make this kind of analysis really useful, I think some ideas or concepts that are borrowed from the financial markets might be useful, because extreme value theory has become really important in the insurance industry, for example, and the notion of how you characterize tail events or black swans from both a data and a analytical standpoint are pretty key. So I think.
Do you have any papers on that you'd recommend?
Yeah, I could pull some things together over time.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I've got some good notes here on the VAR versus standard VAR, conditional VAR versus standard VAR, and extreme value theory and take a look at financial risk.
Right. Yeah. Because
Thank you.
Conditional VAR is something like what you're really getting at here, where it's the loss beyond VAR.
Well, the trick too is, what are you modeling? What problem are you trying to model?
Right.
When we include casualty rates, at least in terrorism, you begin getting into modeling, well, what was the response of the officers on the scene, perhaps? What was the access or locality of emergency services that would shift a wounded to a killed or something like that? What
Right.
are maybe the terrorist fumbled, it was like, to your point, the intention was a much higher casualty attack, but there was some idiosyncratic thing that happened that prevented high casualties. And that gets into a really tricky question because, to your point, maybe 9/11 wasn't intended to be as big as it was, and many of these other smaller ones were intended to be bigger than they were, and that gets into an interesting question. So if there's other approaches to those kinds of questions I can bring in without getting too far afield, I'd greatly appreciate that.
Yeah. And also in the military, as you know, they've really improved their medical response capabilities over time. So things that would have been fatalities now are just wounds.
And that's one reason I refer to human impact and combine killed and wounded, because the distinction there is important. I'm not saying it's not, but it's also a lot of factors outside the control of the terrorist at that point.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
One thought, Tim. I was thinking that perhaps 9/11 was a very meticulously planned incident. And there might be others which are more sporadic incidents. Now, in your model, is the extent of planning a variable, or all incidents are assumed to be planned in the same way?
Prior to this, and this is the question, get to your point of how is the data going to inform the model? Prior to this data analysis, there was no planning variable, and I assume swarm or fisherman attacks were on average. But what I see here is a very sharp difference, and the next slide shows it switches. In the US, it's the swarm attack that is more lethal, whether it's for meticulous planning or something else. But those types of attacks are more lethal, and the fisherman ones are less lethal. In Europe, it's the reverse. It's the meticulously planned non-state actor attacks that are much more lethal. If I can show here, this is Western Europe. So it gets to that question you're having of the relation of the data to the model. And now I'm wondering, should I include that meticulousness or average lethality or some representation of that? Because it does seem to change based on when you talk about slicing a problem, the geography you slice it in, it does seem to have different behavior modes.
Another observation as in the passing I made was that again, it's a question, is the success rate, and I don't know how you measure success, related to affiliation? There seemed to be some correlation in the data, but I mean, I could not eyeball it.
It gets really noisy, which is why I think there may have to be an inferential, because with a lot of these ideologies, there's not many attacks. So you have a small population to begin with. And you have, if the attacks don't succeed, it's a 0. But if one attack exceeds and there's only one attack that year, it's a 1. And so you have this really high degree of noisiness in the data that makes it a challenge to just sort of look at and have an obvious descriptive answer to that question.
Now, can the data also provide any information about the extent of planning?
No.
Yeah.
Unless I go through and make a subjective determination based off the sources and the newspaper articles and the police reports and things like that, there's no column that said, and I wish there was, because this would be great, weeks planning, months planning,
Right.
efforts planning. Something like that.
Yeah, I think
the point I was making was that if you cannot discern that in the data, then would it be appropriate to have that factor in the model?
That's a good question.
Yeah, to Professor Said's point, I think maybe a proxy for that is the actual organizational affiliation, because there's sort of a reputational ranking of sorts among different organizations based on their communications, infrastructure, financial networks, that kind of stuff.
But Tim is suggesting that the correlation is very noisy there.
Yeah, when you break it out by ideology or geography even, it seems that the US and Europe, which makes sense, we're different areas, have very different correlations to that. So to your point, Fred, in Europe, I'd say very strongly, you could say that the affiliated attacks seem to have, as a proxy, more lethality, and that's probably more resources, planning, network training, whatever. But in the U.S., it's the opposite. It's the unaffiliated attacks that do the most damage.
Right.
And so that presents a challenge of just using a proxy simply.
So this difference, is it just because of noise, or is there a clear differentiating factor up there?
And is it a differentiating factor that's meaningful to the problem, I guess, is the question. These are good questions. I mean, because these would have to be tested and looked at the data to see if they can be distinguished.
I mean, just the proximity of Western Europe to centers of terror networks presumably has some effect.
Well, but it may also be, that there's public transportation's more prevalent, and there were several large attacks on public transportation. I know there's been attempted attacks here, but none have gone off. So you have some really large, like the London tube bombings, the Madrid subway bombings, train bombings that have large impacts. Like these are great questions, though. These are things to look into.
But, this is open. I mean, Western Europe is largely open borders, right? I mean, there's a lot of mobility that I think is permissible in Western Europe that's not at all the same as trying to get to the U.S.
That's interesting. That's the geographic, it's a location factor.
Right.
Which is just a, I guess I would say, a parametric difference. Can a parametric difference some sort of explain this difference in the outcomes?
Yeah, I think that would probably be even more interesting if you pulled in the Asian.
I got to keep the scope limited.
I know. I'm just saying.
It was hard enough.
I know. I'm just saying. This is all
further research.
All good future work, right?
Yes.
So what was that, Professor?
All questions for future research.
Exactly. I've got a research program bucket that's filling up nicely.
Yes. No, not part of your dissertation, but
you're right.
It's just backlog.
And actually, this question might help you bound the problem and clearly state the limiting assumptions.
Right.
Bound problem with limiting assumptions. Good.
So Tim, so these are all violent approaches to system state change. Then you get your title now is interesting. So these organizations or individuals, whether they're swarming or being fished, they want to see a system state change. These same groups, are also using other methods to get to that end state. Are you interested in? Is it just? Are you only interested in this path, or are you considering? Because I've seen some publications recently about as you have population demographics changing. Some of these European nations, in 20, 30 years, will be so shifted that they'll have achieved this system state change.
Well, I want to be clear. When I use the phrase system state change, it's a perception, or it's from the perspective of risk of terrorist attack coming, whether it's from swarm or fishermen. That's the only system state change I'm taking, not the goal of the actors themselves, which may include some other system state change or thing they're pushing in their ideology.
Okay.
I'm looking at it from the perspective of where does the risk originated? Self-radicalizing people or people radicalized by groups? So to a bounding point, I think to get back to Professor Said in terms of having clear boundary languages, these are all things that need to be clarified in the boundary discussions. I know we're hitting up to the top of the hour. We're at the tail end of the presentation here. This was a question of, does the system state vary itself within ideology over time? And so I use this because I tried to use a line chart and it became so noisy that it was somewhat not helpful. But I simply, across ideology at the top, and then by region, 2 columns, US and Western Europe, I listed when there was a system state, what it was. And if there's a blank, there were no attacks. So there was nothing to record. which is what makes this data kind of noisy. So by way of the anti-government here, you have US and Western Europe, and it says, of the attacks, what was the majority of the systems or the affiliation of those attacks? And so you can see here the N number is fairly low on a lot of these, but you can say, okay, well, they were fishermen, but there was only one attack and it was affiliated, so they're fishermen. And I highlighted the swarm just to show when it's switching. So in the US, you have fishermen goes to swarm back to fishermen, but again, very low number on a lot of these ones until like these categories have small population samples within the data until we get to things like left wing, right wing, and Takfiri, which has a more full data. So on the left wing here, you see it's fishermen and then a few swarms, and in Europe, it's fishermen throughout, which is very clear to me that at least in Europe, the left wing terrorism comes from non-state actors. These people who are affiliated with groups seems to be a predominant trend. Right wing, you see more of a shift here, increasing the use of the swarm as time goes on, and in Takfiri as well, in US, but not necessarily in Europe. And this was the finding that has been seen now in multiple ideologies, is that the swarm, the evidence is for both, right? There's evidence of swarm behavior in the US and fisherman behavior in Europe. But we're at 11 o'clock here, and I know that there are activities scheduled after mine. So I want to pause here for any final questions or considerations on my feedback on my opening questions.
One last data thought. There are milestones when whether in US or Europe, they change the extent of coordination among different security or police entities.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that matters at all to how the data separates out, I'm not sure, because it's sort of to Lars.
Do you have those milestones?
No.
Okay.
But Lars, the question from Lars raised that, and so after 9/11, for example, there were initiatives to start sharing data among entities and things like that. So if that impacts the data set, I don't know.
Yep, good point. I put a note down. Any remaining questions?
Tim, I don't have any questions, but as you've been talking, I've been downloading the GTD, whatever the data set. So I came in a little late, so I missed your first things. But when you were talking about how you kind of down selected parts of the data set for what incidents you were going to look at, as I look at integrating data analytics and simulation science together, and this is still open. Nobody really knows how to do it, but if somewhere in your report or something, talk about how clean the data is, meaning, when those two other data sets were put together, there were missing values in some. Some of them, it looks like only have like up to 40 variables, and the newer incidents have 120 variables. So if you can talk about how that might be affecting some of the incidents that you have, and then how repeatable creating that data set is.
Great. Discussion of the data set, repeatability, and changes over time. If you get the GTD codebook, it lists those changes, and it has a good history of the changes in their own data set and where some of those gaps may be. So that may be a good starting point, but I'm going to put a note here, but add it myself.
It looked like some of it was done in real time, some of it was retrospective, and now it's in real time again. So that certainly talks to how how things are seen progressing over time. It's how the data was collected and what data is available.
Yeah.
And then a lot of it is coming from open source. So just, be able to talk about how valid the data is, because just because there's a data set doesn't mean, and then you use parts of it, doesn't mean it's easily reproducible. So the actual corpus that you're using, that you've created from all this data set, how could somebody else
recreate
that?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point, because I've looked at some referenced data sets, and graphics that were produced from data sets, and I try to go back to the data sets, go back to the source to look at them. So I'm interested in density of innovation, and I'm having a hard time replicating them.
Yep.
What period they're on and where they're coming from. You go in. I don't know. I didn't spend enormous amounts of hours. Maybe over time I'll be able to get something similar. But
Good points.
And part of it, I think, is on the slide before or after what's being shown now, where you have the types of yes, this one. So the inclusion criteria, from my way of thinking, when you're talking data analytics and data science, these are search terms that you could use. So could you be using anarchist, communist, white supremacy as a search term in other data sets that would create the data set that you're using?
Good point. Search terms in other data sets. Excellent.
And then, I mean, you could rewrite this from a data science perspective, that here's the long search term. These were all the important terms that are useful in creating the data set that I used.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we're at the top of the hour, so I want to thank everyone for their time. Christina, if you want to stop the recording, please.
Thank you, Tim.
And I'll